All right, let's continue our discussion of prey-predator models. We've been through in the previous lectures the basic equations of the Lotka-Volterra prey-predator model. We went through some of the reasons why the assumptions of Lotka-Volterra model are somewhat unrealistic, but it's a really good starting place. Some of these unrealistic assumptions include this functional response. Functional response is just the total prey eaten per predator as a function of the prey abundance. And the Lotka-Volterra model assumes what's called a type 1 functional response. We'll go over that in a little bit, but that's just a line, a linear relationship. So the more victims consumed per predator per time step. You can probably think of some reasons why that's not super realistic, but it's a good starting place. Just the same way we have a numerical response that's linear, and the numerical response just represents the increase in the growth rate of the predator population as a function of victim abundance. The more victims, the more the predator population grows in response to those victims. Again, you can probably think of some reasons why this numerical response is not super realistic, but it gets the job done as a starting place, and we're going to continue working with it as we start talking about the phase plane. So you've gotten a chance to play around with the basic Lotka-Volterra model in Insight Maker and to play around with some of the parameters and what those parameters do to the trajectory of prey and predator over time. That's great, and you even started to maybe look at the phase plane in Insight Maker by using a scatter plot in Insight Maker and selecting the prey for the x-axis and the predators for the y-axis, and you can sort of see how the system moves on the phase plane. But Insight Maker is not the best way to look at the phase plane. Really, of course, R is a better way to look at the phase plane. So if you want to follow along as we start going through the phase plane of the Lotka-Volterra prey-predator models in R, the script is available. So just click on the script, save it to a folder, and load it up in our studio. So if you want to follow along, just pause the video and get started with that. Here's what it should look like. Once you've loaded up in our studio, you should see something that looks like this, and I can maybe even make this a little bit bigger so you can see it even better. All right, well, I'll leave that open because I want to use the plot window too. So, all right. So, of course, the functional responses in R, this is the code that I used to actually produce the figures that are in the website. So there's the linear functional response and the linear numerical response. Functional response, alpha times the prey. Numerical response, beta times the prey abundance. Just simple lines that go through the intercept. Can't be any more simple. And there's the numerical response. But let's talk about the phase plane. So first, let's build a model. Let's build the Lotka-Volterra model, but this time in R and not Insight Maker. So we're going to set the parameters. Oftentimes, first thing we do is parameterize. So we're going to set the alpha and beta to 0.001, init abundance of prey to 100, abundance of predators to 75, R, the intrinsic growth rate of the prey population, to 0.1, and Q, the intrinsic death rate of the predator population in the absence of prey, that is 0.1 here, and we'll run it for 100 years, and the time step will be 1/10 of a year. I don't know why I did that, but that is the way we're going to do it. We have to set up a storage variable, make a function that returns next year's prey and predator abundance given this year's prey and predator abundance and all the parameters that we just set. And we're going to do the simulation. So this just takes a few seconds to run through 100 years of the prey and predator, and there it is. And we can then plot it out on the phase plane. So the x-axis is going to be the prey. So we give the prey abundance and the predator abundance. So I'm going to make a blank plot first. So this is just a simple way to make a blank plot in R. Don't worry about those. But the prey are going to be in the x-axis and the predators are going to be in the y-axis. So here's a blank plot on the phase plane. And we can plot out all the points. Just here's the storage variable that has the prey and predator abundance for the entire 100-year simulation. And I can just, well, there's the, if I just highlight that, I can see the numbers for prey on this first column, and then the predators on the second column. And again, if I was doing this really well, I'd probably want to use whole numbers rather than fractional numbers. But for this, it's fine to use the fractional numbers. And if I run this whole thing, I can see that this is what the Lotka-Volterra model, parameterized as above, looks like on the phase plane. And I don't know if it's intuitive or surprising to you that it is a circle on the phase plane. Well, an egg shape. It's like a very good egg shape. Let's look in a little deeper into this. This is probably what you've already seen in Insight Maker, something that looks like this. But let's dig it a little bit deeper into this and why it's a circle. Here's our starting point. Just arbitrarily, we could start anywhere on this phase plane, but we decided to start here with 100 prey and like 70 predators. So that's where we start, and let's see where we are after year 50. All right, and let's see where we are after year 100. There we are. So what's going on here? Well, where we chose to start this population, there are enough prey in the landscape to have a growing predator population, but the predators have not yet started to control the prey. So both prey and predator are growing over time. All right. If we want to take a closer look at this, let's run it in a kind of animation. All right. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull up this animation, and now we can see the population. So again, the predators are increasing over time because they have enough prey and they're not yet controlling the prey. But as the predator population increases past a certain point, the predators start controlling the prey, and the prey population declines. Now the prey population will decline so much that the predators have to start declining too. So the predators start declining exponentially, and by a certain point, the predators decline so much that the prey population is no longer controlled, so the prey population starts increasing, and guess what? It happens all over again. So that is a basic Lotka-Volterra animation. And let's try a different set of parameters. Let's just, so previously we had alpha and beta as 0.001. Let's move those to 0.005 in here. We'll leave these at the same. We'll make the growth rate of the prey population a little bit higher than the death rate of the predator population. Again, these are arbitrary. Now, if you are playing around with R, I totally encourage you to try some different parameter values and see what happens. But this is the parameter values that we're going to use right now. And again, it takes a couple seconds just to run through the model and make sure and fill in that storage vector with prey and predator abundance, but it is done now, and we can make that blank plot and add the points, and it looks something like this, and we can go through this model too if we would like. We can add a couple. Oops, there we go. Okay, so this way I'm just jittering the points around, and so you can see not only where the system's moving over time, but also the total time spent in some areas of this phase plane. You can see that the density of points is really great down here. So the system obviously spends a lot of time with really low predator and prey abundance now. It's still this cyclic kind of thing going in this direction, but it looks a bit different, and it's no longer a perfect egg shape. So the oscillation pattern has definitely changed just by changing the parameter values. Let's animate it and just see what it looks like over time in the phase plane. So again, we start with the predator populations, this time like totally controlling the prey down to the point where the prey population gets so small, now the predator population is declining exponentially, and at a certain point it declines so much that the prey population can start to grow again. And it just happens really slow because the population size gets really small, so it takes a little while for exponential growth to take over. And now both populations are growing exponentially. The prey population is growing exponentially. The predator population has not yet controlled it, and then finally the predator population explodes and controls the prey population, and the cycle starts all over again. All right, so that's just a brief look at some models in the phase plane. Here we can run the model with different initial abundances. You'll notice that the initial point matters in the Lotka-Volterra system. If you start the initial abundances at some different point in phase plane, the abundance of prey and predators, you'll get a different cycle. If you maybe start closer to this sort of centroid of this cycle, you're going to get less amplitude of the oscillations. So you get something like this. If you start closer, you'll get something like that. So it just, the initial values matter, and we can just show that using this set of code here. Just run a couple more with different initial values, and then we'll plot all three together, and we'll see that the initial values matter quite a bit in terms of the oscillation pattern. So there you have the three different, maybe four that I ran here. And different initial values cause different arcs here in the phase plane. Let's plot these over time. Just so it's nice to be able to go back and forth between the phase plane and time series. So what I mean by time series is just plot these out as trajectories over time, and we see this is what the trajectory looks like over time. And that's for the prey, and there's the predator in green. And so now we have both prey and predator over time. So this is just another way to look at the Lotka-Volterra prey-predator system. This time, instead of in the phase plane, we're looking at the trajectories over time, which is the default way that Insight Maker will present the results of a simulation. All right. So far, so good. So let's move on. Remember in the competition lecture, we went through the phase plane, but we also started plotting arrows in phase plane. At every point in the phase plane, the system knows where it wants to go. And that means that the system has a direction. It doesn't just have a location in the phase plane, but it has a direction. We can visualize those by placing small arrows throughout the phase plane. And we can then see visually like how the system is going to move if started or if placed at any point in the phase plane. And we can kind of map out the trajectories on the phase plane just by following the arrows. So let's run again. This is what I did last time too. Just run a bunch of functions that were written by Paul Hurtado in the math stats department at UNR. So I'm just going to quickly load up all the functions that Paul wrote so we can visualize those arrows. All right. And we can set this final function here, and now we can parameterize a model. Now, if I want, I can go back. Let's go back to that initial model that we had. We can plot the phase arrows. Okay, so this looks nice. We have phase plane arrows here indicating where the system's likely to go. If you start the system here, you can just sort of see this egg-shaped trajectory that the system's going to follow. If you start the population over here, it's going to go like this. So it's just a nice way to really visualize the phase plane. And if we want, we could animate a system on that phase plane. To do that, I'd probably need to go back up and run these numbers again. because I changed the parameter value, so it wouldn't look right if I ran the other simulation on this new phase plane. So let's go back, go through all Paul's code again, and we can hopefully animate this. And this is again the prey and predator growing until the predators start controlling the prey population in this case, and now the prey are declining to the point where the predators actually start declining. They don't have enough prey in the landscape, and they're declining exponentially until at some point where the prey population can start growing again, and at a certain point the prey population gets big enough and can support a growing predator population. So now we can see that just with the arrows overlaid there. So there we go. We can draw isoclines. Here are isoclines, and isoclines again are just those points where either the prey or the predator population is not growing and not declining. So we have two isoclines here. Let's draw them one at a time here. There's our arrows. Let's draw the prey isocline first. And we're going to draw that in red. So that means we're going to separate those points in phase plane that have a growing prey population from those points in the phase plane that have a declining prey population. So let's look for growth in the prey population. Well, we see growth here because if the arrows are pointing to the right here, we see that there's a growing prey population. Now over here, there's a declining prey population. So if you think about it, you can sort of see right here, there's this break between a growing prey population on the bottom of the graph and a declining prey population at the top of the graph. So let's try to, if we draw this isocline here, there we go. That separates a growing prey population below the red line and a declining prey population above the red line. Does that make sense? That above a certain number of predators on the landscape, the prey population is declining. Below that number of predators, the prey population has a positive growth potential. All right. What about the predator isocline? Now we're looking at this y-axis and we're saying, okay, well, the predator population is declining here, increasing here, and increasing here. That is, the arrows point up for increasing and arrows point down for decreasing. So decreasing over here, increasing over here. Now we see that if we draw the isocline, it looks like this. That's where the predator population has zero growth. Does that make sense? Above a certain prey abundance, the predator population is capable of positive growth, and below a certain prey abundance, the predator population is not capable or incapable of growth. It's a declining predator population. All right. So there we go. That's isoclines. It's important that you understand these isoclines because they can really help us understand not only the simple Lotka-Volterra prey-predator model, but a much more complicated versions of the Lotka-Volterra prey-predator model. For instance, models that have density dependence in the prey population, or that have spatial refuges for prey that predators cannot get to. We can draw isoclines that represent those kind of things, and we can kind of understand the system. Just by drawing the isoclines, we can understand the system. And we'll go through that on the whiteboard in a few minutes. All right. Let's see. We'll run a couple other models here. Now this model, for instance, what I did is I included density dependence in the prey population. All right. And we'll go through that again in a few minutes on the whiteboard. But this is what it looks like. The prey isocline, which was a horizontal red line, meaning that above a certain point, the above a certain number of predators, the prey population declined, and below that point, the prey population increased. Now, the prey population can self-regulate. So there's a carrying capacity here, around 25, where the prey population can control itself. And even in the absence of predators, the prey population is regulated, right? So by regulated, meaning there's zero growth, right? At above carrying capacity, the prey population will decline. Below carrying capacity, the prey population will increase. So you can see that in this figure here. Below carrying capacity, prey population increasing, arrows pointing to the right. And above carrying capacity, at zero predators, the prey population is declining. So it takes 0 predators to control the prey population here. It takes 100 predators to control the prey population here. It takes 150 predators to control the prey population here. So we have an isocline that looks like this. Now, if we keep the predator isocline looking like it did before, we get a very different behavior of the system. All we've done here is added density dependence on the prey population. And we can see, we can run the simulation. Just takes a second. And what do we see? We'll run it a few times just to get a sense for our different starting points. We'll keep all the parameters the same, except we're just changing the initial abundances. And we'll just see what happens. There we go. Depending on different starting positions, the trajectory looks a little different, but it ends up kind of stabilizing in this place. Actually, this is just one trajectory, right, over time. I think I missed this. There we go. Now we have some different trajectories. But you see what's happening here by adding prey density dependence, we're kind of settling in on an equilibrium point. There's a stable equilibrium because no matter where we start the system, it ends up converging at the same prey and predator abundance. So this is a stable 2-species equilibrium, and we can plot that on a time series or a time trajectory, and it looks like this, where again we get stable predator population and stable prey population. There's the legend. All right. I'm going to stop there so we can then spend some time on the whiteboard. So here we have a blank whiteboard, and we can start drawing out the phase plane and the isoclines, and it's kind of useful to be able to draw these out yourself and to understand how these systems work just by looking at the phase plane and the isoclines, because you can know a lot about how the system will behave. Just like with the competition models, you can know a lot about how the system will behave just by looking at the phase plane. Okay, so we're still dealing with the very basic, simplistic Lotka-Volterra prey-predator model, and the way we tend to draw this out in the phase plane is we put the predators on the y-axis and the victims or prey on the x-axis. Here's our phase plane, and then we have to draw out the isoclines. So the victims are just limited by the number of predators on the landscape. If there's above a certain number of predators on the landscape, the victim population will decline. If there's below that number, the victim population will increase. So let's move to let's see, I did the victims in red, I think. So we're going to be able to draw an isocline, the victim isocline, that is just dependent on the number of predators. So there we go. The victim isocline is just a horizontal line. Now, below the horizontal line, the victim population can increase. There we go. And above, there's too many predators and the victim population is decreasing, right? So, looks like that. And let's just move this a little bit down. Okay. Now, let's think about the predator population. Oops. I think I did that in blue. And so the predator population will have an isocline that looks like this. Above a certain number of victims, the predator population has enough prey to persist, have a growing population, so the predator population will grow, right, above that. And below a certain number of victims, the predator population does not have enough food and they cannot persist. And so they're declining. All right. So if we go back and we look at these quadrants, in the basic Lotka-Volterra model, we have basically 4 different quadrants. That is 4 different types of growth patterns that we can observe in this phase plane. So if we start the system, if the system's over here somewhere with a small number of victims and a large number of predators, well, what's going to happen? Clearly, the victims are going to decrease because there's too many predators, and the predator population is going to decrease because there's not enough victims. So you have a system where both are declining, right? So it looks like that. And in this quadrant down here, you have very few victims, but you also have very few predators. So the predator population is still declining because there's not very many victims. And the victim population, is actually able to grow because there's not very many predators. So you have this direction here. The predator population is declining because there's not enough victims, but the victim population is doing okay because there are not that many predators. At a certain point, there are enough victims on the landscape so the predator population can start growing again, but there aren't so many predators that they can control the victim population, so they're actually both growing. And then at some point, the predator population grows to the point where they can start controlling the prey population, and the prey population starts declining. But there's still plenty of prey for a growing predator population, so we have a arrow or direction of the system that looks like this. And so if you start the system here, say, you're going to get a growth down this way, but then it's going to turn around this way, and then it's going to turn up, and then it's going to turn around again, and it's going to come back to where it was. So we get this cyclical population dynamics in the phase plane, and you can see it just by dividing the phase plane up into these 4 quadrants. I'll make it this way because this is the way the system actually goes. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the entire behavior of the system, no matter what the starting point is, can be described just by dividing this into 4 quadrants and kind of understanding how the system's going to behave in each of these quadrants. So if you start the system here, you're just going to have a smaller amplitude oscillation, prey and predator. And if you start up here, you're going to have a bigger phase oscillation. So that's the basic Lotka-Volterra prey-predator model drawn out in phase plane. And I encourage you to draw it out yourself. Make sure you understand how this system works and how to draw out the phase plane. One more point here is that this system is defined by a bunch of parameters, right? We have alpha and beta. Alpha defines the functional response, beta defines the numerical response, and we of course have R, the intrinsic rate of growth of the prey population, and Q, the intrinsic rate of death of the predator population. And all these factor into describing how the phase plane works. And of course the initial abundances are just points in the phase plane. This is, large number of victims, smaller number of predators. The abundances are just described by the phase plane itself. So we can draw out the isoclines simply by using these parameters here. So the prey isocline right here, and I can move back to the red, is defined as where the predator abundance is equal to R divided by alpha. All right? And the predator isocline, I'll draw in blue, can be defined here as the number of victims equal to Q over beta. All right? And I'll draw this back in black here. Oops. Okay. And let's move this down. Let's understand why that is. All right. So why is R over alpha the victim isocline, and why is Q over beta the predator isocline? Well, let's look at the Lotka-Volterra model one more time. All right. So Lotka-Volterra model is two equations. One describing the delta victims, right? Change in the victim population is equal to this exponential growth rate times R times V, and then subtract the total predation, which is equal to alpha times V times P. And if you set that to 0, you can get the isocline for that. So then we say 0 equals RV minus alpha VP, and we can then say alpha VP equals RV. We can take out the V. Alpha P is equal to R. And then we say P is equal to R over alpha. That's the condition where there's 0 growth in the victim population. So we set that growth to 0, and that defines the isocline. So the isocline is wherever the predator number is equal to R over alpha, and that's exactly how we drew it above. We can do the same thing with the predators. Here, there's R over alpha. Wherever the number of predators is equal to R over alpha is when the victim population is exhibiting 0 growth. Let's do the same thing with the predators in the Lotka-Volterra model. So that is delta P for predators is equal to minus QP. That's the intrinsic rate of death in the absence of prey, and then we can add beta times V times P to get the total amount by which the population growth increases due to predation. And if we want to set that to 0, then we can start to try to figure out what the isocline should be, BVP. And let's move that down a little bit. And now we can say QP is equal to BVP. We can get rid of the P's. Q equals beta times V, and V is equal to Q over B, which is the isocline for the predators. It's whenever the victim is number of victims equal to Q over B, and we can see that's what we wrote up here. So that's how we can draw out. We can just take the parameters. I don't know how I moved that arrow. It's funny. So there we go. I think that's where it was. We can take these parameters and compute what the isoclines should be. So if we know alpha and we know R, we can compute the victim isocline. If we know beta and we know Q, we can compute the predator isocline. All right. I will talk about some assumptions of the classical Lotka-Volterra model. I'll describe how we can relax some of those assumptions, and then we will be done with the lecture. So as we've seen, the Lotka-Volterra prey-predator model makes some fairly unrealistic assumptions. Let's go through some of these unrealistic assumptions. Number 1, the victim population is regulated only by predation. That is, there's no density dependence in the victim population. That's not really realistic. We know density dependence is, if anything's a law of ecology, density dependent population regulation can probably be called a law of ecology. So that's not super realistic. Another assumption is that the predator feeds only on one species of prey. That is, it's a complete prey specialist, our predator, and it doesn't switch to other species of prey. And if it doesn't have that species of prey, it will decline exponentially because it won't find another source of food. Another assumption that this Lotka-Volterra model makes is that individual predators can consume infinity prey items per time step, theoretically. The more prey are available in the landscape, the more the predators will eat. That doesn't seem super realistic. Now, we think that predators probably get satiated at some point and stop eating because they're full. We also have an assumption that there's no interference among predators. The more predators in the landscape doesn't really affect the amount of prey that can be eaten. Theoretically, predators don't interfere with one another. They don't stop others from feeding. There's no interaction among the predators. That doesn't seem super realistic. And then finally, we assume that the victims have no refuge from predators. That is, in real ecological systems, some prey can actually find places in the landscape that are totally hidden from predators. That is, the predators cannot see them, or they're safe for another reason, just because the predators may be larger body size and just can't reach them in those refugia. So the Lotka-Volterra model assumes that victims have no refugia from predators. But like I've said several times, the Lotka-Volterra model provides a good baseline from which we can expand. So by expanding the Lotka-Volterra model, by changing it, we can relax some of these assumptions and thereby make the model more realistic. We can give the prey a carrying capacity if we want. We can modify the functional response if we want. And we'll talk about that in a second. We can add a refuge for prey, that some prey are just untouchable. We can add a predator carrying capacity. We can do these things, and it's not that difficult to think those through. And using the phase plane, we can kind of understand fairly quickly what the effects are likely to be. And of course, we can play around with these scenarios in Insight Maker, which I encourage you to do at the end of this lecture. So let's first relax the assumption of a victim not having any carrying capacity, like no density dependence in the victim population. That is the assumption that victim population is regulated only by predation. That's kind of unrealistic. They can self-regulate too, using just the standard density dependence models that we've already learned and used. So let's look at a victim carrying capacity, and we can do that. And we already did that in the R example. So we can run through that pretty quickly. If we add a carrying capacity to our prey population, well, what we can see is that at some point, the prey population will self-regulate. Even in the absence of predators, they will have zero growth, which means that point will be on the isocline, because that's what the isocline is, zero prey growth. This is zero prey growth even in the absence of predators, because of density dependence or self-regulation in the prey population. That's the carrying capacity of the prey population. So at really low prey abundances, the growth rate of the prey population is fairly high, and it takes more predators to regulate that system than it does as the prey population gets bigger. They start to exhibit competition amongst each other for resources, and it takes fewer predators to control the population of prey until it gets up to carrying capacity. And so this model ends up, if you actually run this out in Insight Maker or R, by adding a carrying capacity to the prey population, we actually get a stable equilibrium in the system. Whereas in the Lotka-Volterra, the basic model, we have fluctuation in the prey and predator population that goes on forever, theoretically. What we have here is the population that stabilizes at a certain number of prey and predators. There's a certain point in that phase space, number of prey, number of predators, where the population exhibits no growth or decline. Both predator and prey are perfectly stable, so this system has a stable equilibrium. Over time, the system will stabilize at a certain number of predators and a certain number of prey. So that's kind of interesting, and we can take a look at that in more detail in the whiteboard in a second. But let's think about a couple other ways that we can relax these unrealistic assumptions that we make in the Lotka-Volterra prey-predator system. So another one is functional responses. The Lotka-Volterra prey-predator model assumes that prey consumption per predator, that is the functional response, increases linearly with an increase in prey abundance. So it looks like this. The more prey available, the more prey are consumed per predator per time step, until it gets to absurdly high levels. Like if a victim abundance is 1 million, then every predator is consuming hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of prey every time step, and that just starts to get unrealistic. So that's this unrealistic functional response is called a type 1 functional response. And this is a system of classifying functional responses that was developed by C.S. Buzz Halling. Forget when exactly, maybe in the 40s or 50s. It's still used today. So we classify functional responses as type 1 functional responses like this. And then we have two other types, type 2 and type 3 functional responses. So as we've seen, this makes unrealistic assumptions that also include that the predators don't get full, the predators don't interact with each other, and so on and so forth. This is unrealistic, but it's a starting place. Now, the type 2 functional response, we start to relax the assumption that predators can feed on theoretically infinite number of prey, and we take something called prey saturation into account. The predators will consume more prey with increasing prey densities, but only up to a point, and that is that point where predators will eat their fill and they don't want to eat any more. So the type 2 functional response can be described mathematically like this. We have something called the attack rate at which predator-prey encounters increase as prey density increases, which is analogous to the alpha term in the type 1 functional response. We have another term, H, that describes the so-called handling time, or the time it takes to process and digest potentially a single prey item. And that allows there to be a limit in the total number of prey that can be eaten per time period by a predator, because there's this handling time. Sometimes we can understand the term H just by saying, well, let's take the inverse, 1 over H. That is the maximum prey consumption rate. So this model, this type 2 functional response model, asymptotes at a certain prey eaten per predator per time step. Predators can only eat a certain number of prey before they're going to stop eating. So 1 over H just represents this asymptote to this type 2 functional response model. So again, this is a functional response representing the total prey eaten per predator per time step, total prey consumption per predator per time step as a function of victim abundance. Now, as the victim abundance goes up, the total prey eaten per predator starts to decline, right? Because the predators can only eat so much. So hopefully that makes some sense, and that's a commonly used functional response in prey-predator models. And then finally, there's a slightly more complicated type 3 functional response that takes predator learning into account and raises the potential for predators to switch their prey from a less abundant prey to a more abundant prey. And so that means that as the prey becomes more abundant, more predators might switch to focus on that prey. They might develop a search image, and their capture efficiency for that prey will increase with increasing prey abundance. So alternatively, as the prey densities get lower and lower, the predators will decide to not bother looking for the prey, so they will end up switching, and capture efficiency will go down because they won't be looking for those prey items anymore. We can describe the type 3 functional response mathematically using this formula. So we still have an attack rate, which is analogous to the alpha from the type 1 functional response. We still have a H term representing handling time, or 1 over H representing the asymptote of the total prey eaten per predator. And I just realized that this equation didn't render right, but what we're doing here is we're raising the victim abundance to the kth power. So we're adding this new term K that describes this the growth at low victim abundance and how the total prey eaten per predator or the capture efficiency kind of drops off for the predators as the victim abundance goes down at the low victim abundances. And so we add one new parameter, K, that adds one level of complexity to this model that allows for the concept of prey switching. And so it looks something like this. As the victim abundance goes up at low abundances, more and more predators start focusing in, getting a search image for that type of prey. And then after a certain point, the predators start getting saturated and they reach kind of a maximum total prey eaten per predator. So that's kind of the most realistic of the three functional response type. It is called type 3 functional response. So you'll hear the terms hauling type 1 representing this linear functional response, hauling type 2 representing this saturation, predator saturation functional response, and this hauling type 3, which represents the same sort of saturation happening at high victim abundance, but also this reduction in capture efficiency as victim abundance gets lower and lower. All right. Let's draw a couple of these models out on the whiteboard and then we'll be done. All right, here's the classic Lotka-Volterra model in phase plane like we did before, and now let's redraw it, but now we can add a couple of these extra complexities to the phase plane model. So let's add, let's first draw out the phase plane. So we have here predators and victims, and we can draw the prey isocline. Let's draw it like this for now, and draw it like this, so that we're just going to have the basic Lotka-Volterra. Oops, maybe. Basic Lotka-Volterra model with 4 quadrants. And let's think about prey carrying capacity. So when we have a prey carrying capacity, we're going to take this prey isocline. Now at low victim abundances, here's a certain amount of predators that is required to control this victim population. But as the victim abundance gets higher, they start to self-regulate. Their growth rate goes down, their rate of growth, and it takes fewer predators to regulate. So we have a system that looks like this. So we can erase this. And this is what our new phase plane looks like. And we can start to see what's going to happen here. You have down, down, up. And so what do you start to see if you start here, and you can just move through the phase plane, and it ends up equilibrating at a stable equilibrium. And so this is just by adding a density dependence, a realistic process to the victim population, we can get all of a sudden what was a continual oscillation of both the prey and the predator populations to a stable point here. Let's think about functional responses. All right, so let's draw another. So this is prey density dependence here. This is prey density dependence. Let's draw out another phase plane. Predators and victims, and we can draw this there, and this there. So this is the classic Lotka-Volterra system. Now let's think about a type 2 functional response. What does that mean? Well, it means that the predators start to become saturated, right? So as the victim abundance goes up, it's going to take more and more predators to control that victim population, because a lot of the predators are getting saturated, and so it takes more of them to control that victim population. So we actually start to see something more like this. As the victim population goes up, it's going to take more and more and more predators to control or regulate that victim population. So we can erase that original Lotka-Volterra system here, and now we can start to trace out what's going to happen in this system. So we have this, this, this. And so what ends up happening here is that because it takes more and more predators to regulate the system, it gives the prey more time to grow. And the predators then have a bunch of time to grow as well. There are so many victims to consume. The predator population starts to grow, and it ends up eating out the victim population and then declining to extinction. So we end up having both populations go extinct because the predators are able to regulate the victim population but outpace the growth and totally eat out the victims, and at some point this population gets out of control. And so when we just modify the classic Lotka-Volterra to include a type 2 functional response, and this is hauling type 2 functional response, it tends to destabilize the Lotka-Volterra system and will cause the predators to go crazy and eat out all the prey. All right, so I won't go through any more examples here, but I encourage you to think about what might happen in the phase plane with a hauling type 3 functional response, with a refugia for victims, so that even at unlimited number of predators, there's still some victims that or prey that can survive. I encourage you to think about a predator carrying capacity. What would that do if adding a carrying capacity to the predator isocline? And any other complexity that you might imagine adding to this model, prey switching from the predator isocline, perhaps, like that would change things. So we can think about more complex models. We can think about how the isoclines would change. And if we can draw the isoclines, we can kind of predict what's going to happen to the system at any point in this phase plane. So again, just a really useful way to think about these complex system dynamics, going into the phase plane and drawing out these isoclines. All right. And I should mention the Gatelli book has more examples of isoclines under different scenarios, such as predator carrying capacities and type 3 functional responses, and it's worth reading through. All right, let's go back to the lecture, and I just want to introduce the final insight maker activity, which is optional, but I think it would really help solidify your knowledge of prey-predator systems. So step 1 would be to take your base prey-predator model and model density dependence for the prey population and see what happens. And see if you can get that stable equilibrium point just by adding density dependence to your prey model. Then I encourage you to change the functional response. Change it to a type 2 functional response. Use the equation from the lecture just above, and there's the type 2 functional response equation, and try to implement that in Insight Maker and see if we can get that instability of the Lotka-Volterra model with the type 2 functional response. See if that makes sense. And then change the model to account for prey refuges. That is, there's some segment of the prey population that's not accessible to predators. So no matter how many predators there are, they have a refuge. These certain percentage of the prey population. Try implementing that, and you can do anything you want. There's lots of things you could do to add complexity. Have fun with it. Try type 2 functional response and prey density dependence. What happens? And it's really cool because there's no easy, it's like we can't immediately know what's going to go on in these systems. Even fairly simple two-species systems like this, it's hard to predict. So it's great to have these modeling tools that allow us to see the emergent properties of the system with different scenarios, which is really one of the main points that we hopefully have been able to illustrate in this class. And that's pretty much it for this lecture and for the lectures in this class. I do ask that you evaluate this following statement from the Gatelli book, which is similar to a statement that I asked you to evaluate for the competition models. The more independent the predator and the prey are of one another, the more stable the interaction. What does that mean? Now, when we think about multi-species interacting systems, the idea of stability is such an important concept. When is the system stable? When is it unstable? When is the predator going to overeat the prey? Is there going to be a stable equilibrium? When is there going to be more like oscillations over time in the prey and predator population? What drives that? These are the questions ecologists still ask and are applying to real systems, and this is a very much a growing area of ecology and conservation biology and wildlife management. So I encourage you to play around with these models. I hope you have fun with it, and I will see you for a wrap-up lecture on Monday.